The ink on the divorce decree was barely dry when my ex-husband Mark showed up at my front door with a woman I didn't recognize, holding a stack of legal documents that effectively erased me from my own life. They weren't just asking for the house or the car, they were demanding full, sole custody of our 2 children, claiming I was psychologically unfit and a danger to my own flesh and blood. The absurdity of it hit me like a physical blow to the stomach, leaving me breathless on the porch, while the autumn wind whipped through my hair, mocking the domestic bliss I had spent a decade carefully constructing. My own husband, the man who had promised to stand by me through sickness and health, was now standing on my doorstep with a stranger, acting as if I were a ghost haunting a property he now claimed as his own. For 10 years, life had felt like a perfectly curated photograph. Our home was a sprawling Victorian in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood that smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books. Mark was a successful architect, and I was an illustrator who worked from a light-filled studio on the 2nd floor. Our mornings were rhythmic and peaceful. The hiss of the espresso machine, the soft patter of our children's feet on the hardwood, and the way Mark would kiss the top of my head before rushing off to his firm. We were the golden couple of our social circle, the ones who threw the best dinner parties and whose children were always impeccably dressed in linen and wool. I remember those days with a strange, aching nostalgia now. I spent so much time worrying about the grout in the kitchen tiles or the perfect shade of paint for the guest room, completely oblivious to the rot spreading underneath. Mark's mother, Evelyn, was the only one who seemed out of place in our tidy existence. She was a woman of sharp angles and sharper remarks, always critiquing the way I managed the household budget or how I raised the kids. "You're too soft, Clara," she would say, her eyes scanning our living room as if looking for dust. "A woman in your position needs to be iron-willed, or everything you've built will just slip through your fingers." I used to laugh it off, thinking her bitterness was just a byproduct of her own lonely widowhood. I didn't realize she was actually providing me with a map of my own downfall. Our finances were, in retrospect, the soft underbelly of our marriage. Mark had insisted on handling all our investments, citing his superior mathematical mind and his connections in the high-stakes world of real estate. I trusted him implicitly. Why wouldn't I? He was the provider, the protector, the man who had built that house brick by brick with his bonuses and his vision. I focused on the kids, on my sketches, on the simple joy of our Sunday walks in the park. I had inherited a significant sum from my grandmother, a trust fund that I had poured into the renovations of our home and the children's private school tuition. It was a substantial amount, but it was sitting in a joint account that I rarely checked, assuming it was safe under Mark's watchful eye. Looking back, the signs were there, disguised as mundane domesticity. Mark started leaving his briefcase in the car instead of bringing it inside, and he began taking calls in the garage, his voice dropping to a low, urgent murmur whenever I approached. Evelyn started visiting more frequently, often bringing along folders of charitable trusts and tax optimization strategies that she insisted I sign without reading. "It's just paperwork, darling," she'd chirp, her smile never reaching those cold, reptilian eyes. "Mark is worried about the market. You don't want to be burdened with these things, do you? Your art is so much more important." I remember one Tuesday afternoon, the air in the house feeling suddenly heavy, thick with the scent of lilies, Evelyn's perfume. She was sitting at our mahogany dining table, her fingers tapping rhythmically against a leather-bound folio. I had just come down from the studio, my hands stained with charcoal, feeling lightheaded from hours of concentration. Mark was in the room too, his posture rigid, his eyes focused entirely on his mother. When I entered, they both went silent, their gazes snapping toward me like magnets. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. That clock, a family heirloom from my side of the family, suddenly sounded like a countdown. "We were just discussing the children's futures," Mark said, his voice unusually smooth, almost rehearsed. He didn't look at me. He looked past my shoulder, his jaw tight. "Mother thinks it's time we put the house in a secure trust. It's for the best, given the current economic climate." I looked at them, feeling a flicker of unease that I immediately stifled. We were a unit, weren't we? A team? Why did the air feel like it was being sucked out of the room? I walked over to the table, wiping my hands on my apron, and felt a strange chill as I caught the reflection of my own pale face in the polished wood. I was standing in the center of a fortress I thought I owned, entirely unaware that the walls were already being sold out from under me, and the people I trusted most were the ones holding the keys to the exit. The transition from domestic harmony to a theater of shadows didn't happen overnight. It was a slow erosion, like a riverbank crumbling after a storm. I started finding things that didn't fit. A bank statement left in the printer tray showing a massive withdrawal from our joint savings, a sum that, according to Mark, had been reinvested in a low-risk municipal bond. I remember smoothing the paper out on the counter, my brow furrowed. When I asked him about it that evening, his reaction wasn't the usual easygoing shrug. He froze, his glass of scotch hovering halfway to his lips. "It's a tax maneuver, Clara," he snapped, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. "I've told you, stop obsessing over the ledger. You don't understand the complexities of my business, and frankly, you're becoming a distraction." His dismissal stung, but it was the frequency of the calls that truly unnerved me. He'd disappear into the guest bedroom, closing the door firmly, and I'd catch fragments of conversation that made my skin crawl. "The property will be clear by the end of the quarter," or "She won't even realize the title is transferred until the eviction notice arrives." I tried to convince myself he was talking about a difficult client or a construction dispute. I spent nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile the man sleeping beside me, who reached out to touch my hair in his sleep, with the man I heard whispering about clearing assets. I felt like an intruder in my own home, a ghost wandering through rooms that no longer felt like mine. The true breaking point arrived on a rainy Thursday in November. Mark was at a networking dinner, and the house felt cavernous and cold. I was looking for a passport I needed for the kids' upcoming school trip and pulled a heavy, locked filing cabinet away from the wall to retrieve a key I thought I'd dropped behind it. The cabinet, old and neglected, tipped forward, and the bottom drawer, which I had never been able to open, swung wide, its latch rusted and failing. Inside wasn't tax records or blueprints. It was a thick, leather-bound portfolio labeled Dissolution of Assets, M.H.&E.H. My pulse quickened, a dull thudding in my ears that drowned out the rain hitting the window panes. I pulled the papers out. They were legal documents, draft agreements for the total transfer of my grandmother's inheritance, the deed to the Victorian house, and even a power of attorney document that would have granted Evelyn full control over my medical and financial decisions. My name was signed at the bottom of the pages, but the signature, it was a clumsy, pathetic forgery. I sat there on the cold floor, the paper trembling in my hands. The room began to spin. Every breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. I flipped to the last page, and my blood turned to ice. It was a custody affidavit. It detailed a series of fabricated incidents, claims that I was suffering from a mental breakdown, that I was an unfit mother, that I was prone to episodes of erratic behavior. They had been building a case against me for months, documenting every time I had been tired, every time I had been overwhelmed, twisting my life into a narrative of instability. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed by the sheer, cold-blooded calculation of it all. I felt a nausea so profound it forced me to my knees, retching into the silence of the room. My vision tunneled. I looked at the photos of our children on the mantel, smiling, innocent, oblivious, and realized that Mark wasn't just stealing my money, he was stealing my motherhood. He was preparing to erase me entirely. When I heard the front door click open and Mark's heavy footsteps echoed in the foyer, the world slowed to a crawl. My hands were still shaking, but a strange, icy clarity began to replace the panic. I didn't hide the papers. I didn't run. I stood up, clutching the evidence to my chest, and waited in the darkness of the study for him to walk through the door. I was no longer the soft, naive wife he thought he had successfully gaslit. I was a mother whose world had just been shattered, and I was about to show him exactly what a distraction looked like when she finally stopped being patient. The front door clicked shut, followed by the muffled jingle of keys hitting the console table. Mark whistled a low, jaunty tune, a sound that, only moments ago, would have signaled safety and the end of a long day. Now, it sounded like the screech of a predator. I stood in the middle of the study, the heavy floorboards barely creaking under my feet. The moonlight filtered through the sheer curtains, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. When he walked in, his suit jacket slung over one shoulder, he stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't even have time to register the look on my face before he saw the open drawer and the stack of documents clutched to my chest like a shield. "Clara," he said, his voice dropping an octave, instantly shifting into that practiced, conciliatory tone he used to diffuse arguments. "What are you doing in here? You know that cabinet is... It's locked for a reason. It's work, honey. Put it down." He took a step toward me, his hands raised in a gesture of fake surrender. His eyes, however, weren't soft. They were scanning the room, assessing the threat, looking for an exit strategy. I didn't move. I felt a cold, jagged spike of adrenaline course through my veins, sharpening my focus until every detail of his face, the slight sweat on his forehead, the way his pulse jumped in his neck, became hyper-defined. "Work?" I repeated, my voice sounding alien, hollow, and hard as flint. "Is this what you call work, Mark? Forging my signature on documents that steal my children, that sell the roof over our heads while we're sleeping under it?" He stopped, his face shifting from concern to a cold, hard mask. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The mask of the loving husband fell away, revealing a man I realized I had never actually known. He didn't stutter, and he didn't apologize. He just sighed, a sound of profound annoyance, as if I were a child who had interrupted his chess game. "You weren't supposed to find that yet," he said, walking to his desk and pouring himself a drink. "Honestly, Clara, it would have been much cleaner if you'd just signed the papers when Evelyn brought them to you. You made this messy." "Messy?" I took a step forward, the papers crinkling in my white-knuckled grip. "You were planning to declare me unfit and send me to some sanitarium so you and your mother could move that woman. I saw the emails, Mark. I saw the name Elena into my house, with my children." His eyes narrowed. "Elena is a partner, someone who understands the stakes of the world I live in. Unlike you, who spends her days painting pictures and living in a fantasy world of domestic perfection. You're a liability, Clara. You're too emotional, too volatile. The courts will see that, especially with the evidence my mother has compiled." Just then, the front door opened again. Evelyn. She walked into the study with the confidence of an owner, her fur coat dripping with rain. She stopped when she saw us, her sharp eyes darting to the documents in my hand. A smirk, thin and cruel, spread across her lips. "I told you, Mark," she said, not looking at me but addressing her son as if I were an inanimate object. She was always far too curious for her own good. It's a pity. I had hoped we could have settled this without a scene. It would have been so much better for the children's sake. I looked from the mother to the son, realizing the depth of the rot. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a conspiracy. "You think you can just erase me?" I asked, my voice rising. "You think I'm just some naive housewife you can dispose of?" Mark finally looked at me, his gaze devoid of any remaining affection. "Clara, look at the reality of your situation. You have no money, no leverage, and a fabricated medical history that says you're unstable. Who are the police going to believe? A successful architect and his distinguished mother? Or a woman who just had a nervous breakdown in her own study? Put the papers on the desk, go upstairs, and we'll discuss how much of a settlement you can take to disappear quietly." The audacity of his demand was so staggering that it silenced the room. I felt a wave of clarity, a cold, crystalline sense of purpose. I realized then that they weren't just taking my life. They were waiting for me to break so they could claim the spoils. But they had miscalculated one crucial thing. They assumed that because I played by the rules of our marriage, I didn't know the rules of the law. I stepped back, tucking the documents deep into my sweater, and let out a soft, mirthless laugh that made them both flinch. The laughter died in my throat, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like the air in the room had turned to lead. Evelyn stepped closer, her heels clicking against the hardwood with the rhythmic precision of a ticking bomb. "Your dramatics are exhausting, dear," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "Do you truly think those papers have any value in a courtroom? They are drafts. Mark has already filed the genuine articles with the court. By tomorrow morning, you will be served with an injunction that will restrict your access to the children and the property. You have lost before you even realized the game had begun. I looked at Mark. He was watching me with a mixture of pity and calculated impatience, tapping his fingers against the mahogany desk. He looked so comfortable, so smug in his certainty that the world was built to serve him. "She's right, Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a low, soothing cadence that he clearly intended to be patronizing. "You've always been prone to these little outbursts. It's part of your condition. Just give me the file, go to sleep, and tomorrow we can talk about how you're going to transition out of the house. Don't make me involve the authorities. I'd hate to see you escorted out of here by the police in front of the kids." That was the second twist, the threat of the police. My heart hammered against my ribs, but the fear was different now. It was fuel. I realized that Mark had already planted the seeds for his narrative. He wasn't just planning to leave me, he was planning to incinerate my reputation to ensure he kept everything. "You've already called them, haven't you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mark blinked, his composure faltering for a microsecond. "I did what I had to do to protect my family's future," he replied. "You mean your mistress's future?" I retorted. "Don't pretend this is about protection. This is about greed." Evelyn let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Greed? You've lived off my son's labor for a decade. You've spent his money on your little projects while he built an empire. You owe us, Clara. You owe us everything." I reached into the inner pocket of the file I had retrieved. I had found something else in that drawer, something they hadn't realized was missing because they had been too busy looking at the documents. It was a digital voice recorder, a small, black device that I had noticed Mark using to dictate notes. He had accidentally left it in the drawer during one of his frantic asset management sessions. I pressed play. The room flooded with Mark's own voice, clear and cold, detailing the entire scheme. He spoke of the forgery, the plan to manipulate the psychiatric evaluations, and, most damning of all, he admitted to embezzling funds from his own firm to hide them in offshore accounts under his mistress's name. The silence that followed was electric. Mark's face drained of color, his jaw dropping as he listened to his own voice betray him. Evelyn's smirk vanished, her hands flying to her throat as if she were being strangled. "Did you think you were the only one who kept records, Mark?" I asked, my voice now steady, lethal. "You taught me that everything in this house has a ledger. You just forgot that in this house, I'm the one who keeps the books." Mark lunged for the device, but I was faster. I stepped back, my eyes fixed on his with a terrifying, icy intensity. "Don't you dare," I warned. "The police aren't coming here to remove me, Mark. I sent a copy of this recording, along with the documents you forged, to your firm's lead partner and the district attorney's office 2 hours ago. They're already on their way, and they aren't here for a custody negotiation." The realization hit them like a physical force. The smug arrogance, the sense of entitlement, the belief that I was a broken, spineless woman, it all crumbled. Mark fell back into his chair, his hands trembling as he stared at the device. Evelyn looked as if she had aged 10 years in 10 seconds, her gaze darting to the window as if looking for an escape. For the first time, I wasn't the victim in the room. I was the one holding the gavel. I stood there, clutching the evidence of their ruin, and felt the power shift. I wasn't just offending my children, I was dismantling the house of cards they had built on my life, and I was enjoying every single second of their collapse. The transformation wasn't a sudden explosion, it was the chilling, precise click of a trap closing shut. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, cutting through the heavy rain, the air in the room seemed to vibrate with the weight of impending justice. Mark looked small, shrunken really, as he scrambled to reach for his phone, his fingers fumbling on the screen. He was already calling his attorney, his voice cracking with a desperate, pathetic urgency. I didn't move to stop him. I stood by the fireplace, the digital recorder held firmly in my hand, watching the man who had been my partner for a decade disintegrate in real time. "It's over, Mark," I said, my voice as calm as a winter morning. "You wanted a fight, and you wanted to destroy me. You succeeded in one thing. You destroyed the man I used to love, but you'll never touch my children." When the officers arrived, they didn't look at me with the suspicion Mark had promised. They looked at the file I had laid out on the desk with clinical precision. They saw the fraudulent deeds, the forged signatures, and the clear-cut evidence of embezzlement. As they led Mark out in handcuffs, he didn't even look at me. His head was bowed, his vanity stripped away, revealing the coward underneath. Evelyn tried to scream, to spin a narrative of victimhood, but an officer silenced her with a stern, "Ma'am, anything you say will be used against you." Seeing them leave, watching the front door close on the people who had tried to erase me, felt like exhaling a breath I had been holding for 10 years. The fallout was absolute. The firm conducted an immediate audit, discovering the systemic theft Mark had orchestrated. He didn't just lose his marriage, he lost his career, his standing in the community, and his freedom. The custody battle, which he had intended to use as a weapon, became the final nail in his coffin. The evidence of his intent to manipulate the kids against me was deemed grounds for a total loss of parental rights. The court saw him not as a father, but as a predator. 6 months later, the Victorian house was quiet, but it was a warm, peaceful silence. The smell of cinnamon and old books remained, but the oppressive, heavy tension was gone. I had reclaimed the house, the inheritance, and, most importantly, the space to breathe. My studio was filled with fresh canvases, and the sunlight caught the dust motes dancing in the air, not as something to be scrubbed away, but as part of a life that was finally mine to curate. I was sitting on the veranda one evening, watching the children play in the garden. They were laughing, their voices ringing out like bells in the twilight. A close friend, who had stood by me during the long legal proceedings, sat nearby with a glass of wine, her gaze soft as she watched me. "You look different," she remarked. "Stronger, like you were tempered by fire." I looked out at the garden I had saved. The world had tried to break me, and in the process, it had forced me to build a foundation that no one could ever shake again. I wasn't just a mother or an artist or a former wife anymore. I was the architect of my own survival. I turned to her and smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. "I'm not tempered by fire," I said, feeling the cool evening air on my skin. "I am the fire." The past was a closed chapter, a lesson etched in stone, but the pages ahead were blank, and for the first time in my life, the pen was entirely in my hand. I wasn't waiting for a hero to save me, because I had discovered the only person I ever needed was the woman standing in the mirror. I took a sip of wine, looked at the horizon, and finally, truly, began to live.